Final Fantasy XIII-2, the story so far.
Well, this is a dream after all. But why did you come?
Because you needed help.
Oh, you've never met Fang before, have you?
No.
We've come to pull you out of this fantasy of yours.
Few modern titles in the Final Fantasy canon have been burdened with as much revisionist framing as Final Fantasy XIII. Since its 2010 release, a dominant narrative has calcified within the gaming discourse that Final Fantasy XIII-2 was the necessary fix for its predecessor's perceived failures. The sequel offered more freedom, more exploration, and more agency. It replaced the hallways of Cocoon with branching paths of the Historia Crux. For many, this framing feels intuitively correct. XIII-2 is undeniably more approachable. It removes friction, eases the pressure of combat curve, and provides the traditional RPG distractions, minigames, side quests, and towns that the original omitted. But approachability is not the same thing as artistic strength. I like to argue that Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a weaker work precisely because it abandons the rigid design philosophy that allowed 13 to function as a cohesive, emotionally resonant tragedy in trading constraint for comfort. XIII-2 sacrifices the narrative momentum and thematic pressure that gave the original its lasting impact. The hallway criticism of Final Fantasy XIII is often leveled as if linearity were a technical accident or a sign of developmental laziness. In reality, 13's structure is a masterclass in teleological design. Everything in the game, from the level layout to the combat mechanics, is driving towards a singular, unavoidable end. In 13, the protagonists are l'Cie, branded by gods, hunted by their government, and cursed with a focus they do not fully understand. The linear paths are not just levels, they are a physical manifestation of this curse. The party cannot turn back, cannot wander into a town for a game of cards, cannot engage in the leisurely world building typical of the genre. They are in a state of constant kinetic flight. To allow for exploration would be to break the ludonarrative tension of being a fugitive on the run. 13's controversial level caps, the Crystarium expansion limits, serve a vital purpose. By preventing players from grinding past difficulty curves, the game ensures that every boss encounter remains a tactical puzzle. You cannot outlevel the tragedy. Unlike XIII-2, where a powerful monster build can trivialize the experience, 13 demands that the player master the paradigm shift, a rhythmic, high-speed dance of roles that mirrors the frantic nature of the character's survival. The most profound example of how 13's linearity serves its emotional core is found within the character of Sazh, specifically during the Nautilus arc. While XIII-2 offers a variety of emotional beats, they rarely achieve the sustained, suffocating intensity of Sazh's journey. For me, Sazh is the soul of Final Fantasy XIII. Unlike the teenage archetypes common in the genre, Sazh is a middle-aged father motivated by a singular, agonizing goal: saving his son, Daj. His comic relief persona is a thin veneer, a defense mechanism against a world that has branded him a monster. The scene in Nautilus where Sazh discovers his son has been turned to crystal and subsequently attempts suicide is one of the most daring moments in the franchise. It works because the game refuses to let the player look away. In a more open game, the player might have been distracted by a side quest or a minigame before or right after this moment, diluting the emotional buildup. What connected deeply with players was the nakedness of Sazh's grief. The scene is not about spectacle, it's about the silence that follows the collapse of hope. When Saz points his pistols at Vanille and then himself, the game forces the player to inhabit the claustrophobia. There is no escape to a different time period or a different map. The themes of the scene, parental failure, the cruelty of fate, and the search for agency in a deterministic world resonate because they are human. Saz's struggle isn't against a dark god, it's against the feeling that his life no longer belongs to him. By forcing the player to walk through the hallway of Saz's depression without the relief of side content, 13 creates a shared burden between the player and the character. It's an empathetic connection that 13-2's fragmented structure simply cannot replicate. The contrast between Saz and Yule exposes the most fundamental emotional weakness of Final Fantasy XIII-2, the abstraction of pain. Yule is, on paper, one of the most tragic figures Square Enix has ever written. A seer cursed to witness every possible future, doomed to die again and again as timelines collapse around her. She embodies the cruelty of fate as thoroughly as any character in the 13 mythos. Her suffering is cosmic, infinite, and unavoidable, and yet it never lands with the same force as Saz's despair. The reason is not a lack of pathos, nor a failure of performance or music. It is structural. Yule's tragedy is theoretical, while Saz's is embodied. Saz's pain is rooted in a singular, irrevocable moment, the crystallization of his son. It is not an abstract curse imposed by the universe. It is deeply human failure that internalizes as his own fault. His despair does not repeat across timelines. It does not reset. It accumulates. The Nautilus sequence forces the player to sit inside the accumulation. Yule, by contrast, suffers endlessly, but never conclusively. Her deaths are numerous, foreseen, and narratively reversible. Each time she appears, the player already knows the outcome. The tragedy becomes cyclical rather than terminal, because the Historia Crux allows timelines to be closed, rewritten, or abandoned. Yule's suffering begins to resemble a system state rather than a lived experience. She is less a person enduring pain than a symbol of a broken cosmology. This is where 13-2's time travel undermines its emotional core. Tragedy derives its weight not from repetition, but from finality. Saz's despair matters because there is no version of the timeline where Daz's crystallization did not happen. There is no gate to close, no paradox to resolve. The pain must be carried forward. Yule's deaths, however sincere, are narratively provisional. If they exist to motivate Caius, to illustrate the cruelty of time, and to justify the plot mechanics, they are never allowed to scar the player in the same way. The knowledge that another version of Yule exists somewhere in the timeline drains each individual loss of permanence. Ironically, Yule suffers more, but Saz hurts deeper. This is not a failure of character writing, it is a failure of narrative containment. 13 understood that for despair to resonate, it must be enclosed, inescapable, and uninterrupted. 13-2, by design, refuses enclosure. It disperses suffering across timelines, diluting emotional density in favor of a conceptual scope. Where Saz's grief crushes inward, Yule's tragedy diffuses outward. And in storytelling, diffusion is the enemy of impact. Final Fantasy XIII-2 responds to the hallway complaints by introducing the Historia Crux, a non-linear time travel system. While this provides freedom, it effectively kills the narrative's sense of urgency. Places like the Archlight Step in 13-2 are often cited as improvements. They are vast and open. However, much of this space is narratively empty. Exploration becomes elective rather than essential. In the original 13, every step forward felt earned because the world was hostile. In 13-2, the world is a playground. When exploration is divorced from the character's survival, it becomes content rather than storytelling. Narrative power is derived from escalation. In 13, the pressure builds constantly until the final confrontation in Eden. In 13-2, that pressure is constantly bled off. If a player finds a boss too difficult or a story beat too heavy, they can simply jump to a different time period to catch monsters or finish side quests. This exit ramp design ensures the player is never uncomfortable, but also ensures that they're never truly challenged by the story's stakes. The shift from Lightning to Serah as the lead protagonist further illustrates the move from friction to comfort. Lightning is a confrontational, deeply flawed woman who uses aggression to hide her vulnerability. Her arc is about learning to trust others while under extreme duress. She is a difficult character to like, but a fascinating one to watch. Serah, on the other hand, is inherently likable, kind, and empathetic. While she is a strong character in her own right, her journey lacks the internal friction that defined Lightning. Serah's goal, finding her sister, is noble, but it rarely forces her to confront her own shadows in the way the original cast was forced to. Furthermore, 13-2's reliance on time travel hollows out the concept of consequence. In the original game, death and crystallization felt like terminal, tragic ends. In 13-2, the ability to close gates and reset timelines reframes the tragedy as a temporary state. When the timeline can be rewritten, the emotional weight of a character's sacrifice, such as the repeated deaths of Yule, begin to feel like a mechanical loop rather than a narrative tragedy. Don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a very good video game. It has a stellar soundtrack, a refined combat system, and a charismatic new sidekick, Noel. But the game is designed to please the player, whereas Final Fantasy XIII was a game designed to challenge them. Final Fantasy XIII does not ask to be liked, it asks to be endured. Its linearity is its greatest strength, a structural mirror to the lives of its characters who are being herded towards a destiny they didn't choose. By removing the hallways, 13-2 removed the very walls that gave the story its shape. In the end, 13-2 is a pleasant journey through time. But Final Fantasy XIII is a scar, and in the world of storytelling, a scar born of pressure and pain is always more memorable than a pleasant walk.